Welcome to Cygest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Kia ora koutou, welcome to another episode of Cygest. My name's Rebecca Bloomer, and today I have the great pleasure of talking with Dr. Jim Walker and Peter Welch, who are respectively a principal scientist heavily involved with the pipfruit industry here in New Zealand and Plant and Food's Hawke's Bay site research orchard manager, about the Cyclone Gabrielle event that hit Hawke's Bay in mid-February of this year, a hideously devastating event that came at the end of an already really wet summer. We're going to be talking about the implications for the industry, the event on the day, and talking mostly about Plant and Food's own involvement in the immediate response, but also what we can do to support the industry as it builds back better going forward. So first of all, I'm going to be speaking with Jim, and I'll talk to Peter for a little bit shortly afterwards. Jim, welcome.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I wondered if, to start with, we could talk about your own experience of the cyclone. This was mostly an overnight event, right? So did you have any idea what you were waking up to?
No, we didn't. It was really quite surprising because I think everybody was prepared in their mind for Cyclone Gabrielle, and most of us knew that it was coming. Most of us had done the sort of things around the property to prepare for it.
Securing the trampolines, that sort of stuff?
Those sort of things, clearing the spouting. But really, we went to bed on February the 13th around about 10 o'clock at night. And it was a wild, wild night. Woke up early next morning and, by about 8 o'clock in the morning, the sun had come out. And all we were really looking at was what was down. The trees were down. The power was off. There was no phones, no connection. So you knew that it had been a wild night, but you didn't really understand what had actually happened.
None of that's necessarily immediately particularly unusual, is it? It only takes a tree over a power line to knock a few things out.
No, but we knew that there were just the intensity of that of the rain. So, first going out, just walking down around the streets, and this was in Havelock North at the time, seeing the flooded Karamu stream only literally a couple of metres below the bridge across the road.
Which is quite amazing, right? Because that sits normally in quite a deep gully with a beautiful walkway alongside it.
Yeah, all of that totally submerged. And so, I guess it was really the lack of information in the first instance that was quite profound. So for many of us, I guess, didn't realise what was actually happening and what had happened during the night for actually quite some time, just because the power was out. There was no communication. So, of course, the events of that night and the early hours and that of the morning were all really about the infrastructure that had failed, the stock banks that had been breached, and the rescues and that had been taking place across the Hiratonga Plains, basically all through that night and early morning.
Sure, but it was really much later, I guess, in the day, or even a day or two later, by the time many folks in Hawke's Bay would have had a real understanding of what those impacts had been, particularly around the Esk Valley and around Pakowhai and Omahu.
Yeah, if you had a radio, then you knew that, yes, that the worst had happened.
But those are actually surprisingly uncommon now, and then often not even part of people's cell phones anymore.
No, well, and also you might have radio, but have you got batteries?
Yeah.
Because a radio without some form of power is no radio at all. So yes, it was really, it took some time for the information on the extent and the gravity of the situation to actually feed back through into many of the people who were not directly inundated to begin to understand the real impact on Hawke's Bay.
Sure, and those impacts are phenomenally far-reaching for many people, but we are going to focus specifically today on the impact that it's had on the pipfruit industry in Hawke's Bay, which is particularly impacted because many of its prime growing regions are along the floodplains, right along the edges of some of those stock banks that breached. So presumably it's a few days later by the time this starts to become clear, but what were the initial impacts that the industry became aware of?
We knew of the extensive inundation, the orchards, some orchards and that had been totally submerged. just really the extent of the devastation and almost the shock, and that, I guess, making sure that everybody was accounted for and people were safe and all of those sort of things was sort of happening. And it was probably the realization that, we'd had an event of this magnitude at the time when apple harvest had really only just started. So quite literally, February the 13th, 14th was the day. The fact that normally by that time we'd be about a week or so into Royal Gala harvest.
And Royal Gala is one of the earliest cabs off the pipfruit rank, yes?
Yep. So it was just almost unimaginable. And I think a lot of people were actually in shock for a period of time. And, in our own circumstances, work here was closed. We couldn't attend to issues on our own orchard because of the flooding that along the road through this area itself. That first week, everybody was just sort of thinking, how do we move forward from here? What do we do next? So in dealing with that, that was actually quite difficult because the crop maturity was still advancing, and we had to think about what was recoverable in terms of the crop and really coming up with guidelines for harvest and harvest management. Now that the waters had abated to some extent, but knowing that we had areas now that were quite heavily silted, a lot of rubbish and trash in some of the trees that had been completely inundated. Mm-hmm. Those trees couldn't be harvested. So really it was initially a bit of a stock take and thinking, are we going to harvest these trees? What trees are harvestable? Where have we got recoverable crop? So,
and was there anywhere to take it even if the infrastructure is damaged, I suppose?
Well, that's the other part of it. Some of the roads, particularly through the Parkaway area, impassable, and certainly out towards Links Road and other areas and that were quite badly affected. So yes, the whole thing was stock take. What are we going to do? What needs to be done? How quickly it needs to begin to get to what you would call a recovery phase, where we think about what crop we can recover, because it's a vitally important time of the year. All of the seasonal finance has gone into the crop at that point, and thinking about
what can be saved. And initially that's really literally of the harvest, and we'll think about the orchard itself later.
So during this time, of course, a lot of work going on in New Zealand apples and pears, a lot of discussions in that with Plant and Food at the time, and particularly our people in that whole area of food safety to define the areas where we could safely harvest fruit that was above the flood zone.
Yeah.
Unaffected. So there was initially coming up with the criteria where growers could harvest fruit, and that was really quite important to get that identified quite quickly. And probably within a matter of days, we had growers who were getting on and harvesting their crops in those flood-affected areas.
And there is a real spectrum of what we mean by flood affected too, right? From, a bit of standing water that wasn't draining freely through to, as you say, this orchard was literally underwater.
Yeah, and with that, very different levels of silt deposited and mud.
And different challenges for getting in and actually picking, I presume.
Yes, and I mean, in the worst case scenario, some orchards up to 1 metre of silt deposited, but for many orchards, perhaps 20, 30 centimetres of silt, right down to sort of 5 to 10 centimetres of silt. So lots of different scenarios. All of that takes some time for it to dry, to be able to work off those surfaces again. So we had an area, potentially, it might have been up to 750, 800 odd hectares that were silt affected. But then we had a much larger area that was water affected. That was really where the water had gone through or was still sitting on the ground. No silt necessarily associated with that. All through that period, the rain came and went, but it came back again. So we had a period where the whole water table, the confined part of the aquifer, was saturated, silted in many instances, and more rain falling. So it was actually quite difficult to access sort of some of the blocks because of the mud.
There's just nowhere for that water to go.
And nowhere for the water to go. So potentially of the 8,000 odd hectares of apple production in Hawke's Bay, up to 50% of that was waterlogged for a period of time. Up to, depending on the area, for up to about 4 weeks.
Wow.
Which
is a long time with wet feet.
For trees to be standing in water. So some of the real consequences of that are still to play out. Some of the damage in that we see is, immediately obvious where you've got silt and rubbish affected trees, where the water literally swept through, and trees that were partially or wholly submerged. But there's a good proportion of orchards out there that had to actually endure wet feet at a time when the trees are at sort of maximum stress, carrying a full crop, needing to be harvested, and we've still got waterlogged soil conditions. So that will play out over time because some of those trees will be susceptible to the various root rots, and that apparently symptomless because at this time they're not showing those issues, but the damage to roots and that takes somewhat longer to express. So we'll see that.
Sure. So you're seeing what kind of visually appear going into autumn to be sort of more or less healthy trees, but what's going on beneath the surface may be quite different, and we'll start to see that when we reach bud break quite soon, I suppose.
Yes, as soon as those trees begin to break bud and go into flowering and then fruit set, that's another period of stress. What damage has been done to the root systems will become apparent at that time for up to potentially about 50% of the Hawke's Bay industry.
It's a lot. We've got a good sort of 6 months at least before we see the full magnitude of those consequences then.
Yeah.
Sure. And that presumably is everything from some trees really won't make it through others that can be nursed along but will struggle for a little while to produce the loads that they've previously been able to carry.
Yeah, and in fact some trees and growers will be challenged by what crop load they set up on sort of some of those trees this season, because the root systems, damaged root systems, cannot carry the same crop. If you try to, then you risk the health and the future of the tree.
Sure. So I guess this brings me to the next question that I'd wanted to ask, which was, you've touched a little bit on PFR's role in that immediate response, which was really around determining what could safely be harvested and saving what could be saved of this year's crop. But there's going to be a lot of decision making to be made in the coming months, or has been made already, I guess, with pruning and things. That's going to determine how things go from here, and that we can learn from and perhaps help to inform the industry on as well. So what can we do to help and support the industry, do you think?
So really, in terms of the immediate response, was determining the harvestable fruit. We couldn't get sprayers through there. We couldn't get tractors and that through some of these blocks to have a good crop protection program for what was an incredibly wet period. Fruit rots, all of those things we needed to take into consideration. So we needed to have and understand the implications of this extremely wet period on the crops. Are the crops going to hold up once packed? So there was a lot of work done around the durability, the marketability, the performance of the fruit that went into storage to make sure.
With our post-harvest teams, I suppose?
With our pathologists, really looking at the fruit to see what fruit, did it have the legs for storage, and what fruit rots. We had work going on also trying to understand the nature of the silt that was deposited in those areas and the extent of the waterlogging. So we had another team of people working in that space to try and understand. On a floodplain, we've got some very different soils. We've got soils that are poor draining, and we've got soils that are well drained. That's just the nature of the floodplain. We've got braided riverbeds underneath some of those soils, free draining. Identifying what actions needed to be taken with respect to remediation, getting removal of the silt, managing what was potentially asphyxiation of the trees, either by the silt or by the water in the silt, and then underneath that, the soil moisture itself. So it was really sort of understanding those remediations that were appropriate for different scenarios, depending on what soils you had and what was the nature of the silt.
It's an enormous amount of complexity, isn't it? It's not going to be one solution or even probably 10 solutions for your growers.
Exactly. So it was really heartening to see the communication and that amongst the growers themselves. Really important WhatsApp application on the phone. AgFirst got that application up and running fairly quickly, and growers were amazingly inventive and communicative on what solutions they could be using to remediate the silt. Everybody was concerned about waterlogging of the trees, asphyxiation of the trees, the roots. Something needed to be done to get the silt away from around the base of the trees as quickly as possible. The other thing was also aerial rooting. If the roots are buried in the silt for too long, the rootstock is not performing, but potentially the scion then roots into...
The scion itself starts to form roots, of course.
Starts to grow, and all of a sudden your dwarfing rootstock is no longer a dwarfing rootstock. So
that problem hadn't even occurred to me.
So a lot of these challenges, things had to happen quite quickly, and all through a difficult period. You had to try and also harvest a crop to get some income.
Yeah, and for many of those folks, they may well have been managing flood-damaged homes and things as well. What a stressful time.
Not just flood-damaged homes, but bins were everywhere for some growers. You know, bins were out to sea. Bins were all over the place, so not necessarily your bins, but somebody else's bins that were now dirty, unclean, needed to be cleaned up. There was just sort of so much activity, cars and vehicles that were submerged on orchards. So a lot of those things, they're all issues and challenges in the middle of a harvest. Some of that will be continuing as we go into this new season. That will have to be ongoing, because when the trees come into stress again, when we get through into flowering and bud burst, that sort of state, and fruit set, setting up those trees correctly for the amount of root damage that they have suffered is actually going to be really quite critical as to whether or not those trees survive.
What do you mean when you say setting them up correctly?
Crop load.
Right.
So previously, you know, a large, well-producing tree might have been carrying, you know, perhaps 500 to 600 fruit per tree, depending on your growing system. Some of those trees might only be able to carry a third of that fruit going into the coming season because of the seriously compromised root systems, the root damage that's been done.
And again, excuse my ignorance, but is that achieved mainly through pruning, mainly through thinning?
Pruning is probably part of it, but it will have to be probably through thinning and making sure that trees that have been stressed are not overcropped, or otherwise they will die.
And are there good tools for growers already, or will they already have a good handle on to what extent they can expect root systems to be compromised and adjust accordingly?
That's where science turns into a bit of an art, because on every property where you've got low-lying and poorly drained areas on your orchard is understanding what the variation might be on your orchard and for how long, you know, trees were immersed in water.
So there's a real mix, I guess, there of, you know, you can bring all the science in the world, but at the end of the day, the grower knows their block.
Yeah.
And it'll be knowing where your low spots are and those kinds of things that will influence that decision making.
Yeah. And it's really quite important that tree survival is maximised, because if you end up with an orchard that's got gaps in it, the whole profitability of fruit growing becomes actually really quite challenging. You've got to have a highly productive orchard. You can't actually have gaps and larger areas within your block with dead trees. So that whole area is challenging. So a lot of this is leading from what I would call the immediate flood response through into how do we manage going forward. And that's really the point that we're at now, and the industry is organising. In fact, tomorrow we're off to a field walk through one of the affected orchards, and that is an industry organised meeting where people with knowledge and that of the control of Phytophthora, looking at the whole management practices on this orchard rather critically, and using that as an opportunity to bring people together and help to identify perhaps what might be appropriate for their circumstances.
Are there previous experiences in the region or elsewhere I guess I'm thinking New Zealand immediately, but anywhere where we can draw on for some of this knowledge?
We haven't seen anything like this in apples. At times we've had long periods of waterlogging, but in the winter months, never when the trees have been under maximum stress in full crop. And never for this period of time, out to about 4 weeks. So when Cyclone Bowler came through, that really affected kiwi fruit, perhaps more in the Gisborne region at that time. It didn't really have that much impact on apples here in Hawke's Bay. So Bowler was a similar time. It was a March event, but it affected kiwi fruit quite badly. But you can't compare kiwi fruit and apples.
Yeah, sure.
And the situation with us, we didn't really have any situation to look at and compare with apples. Perhaps Gita in Motueka. That was about 4 or 5 years ago that Cyclone Gita came through. So there was a little bit of information, but that wasn't of the same scale, and it wasn't really quite of the same. It was different.
Yeah, sure.
To our
So
circumstances.
this is very much folks learning as they go with this one then.
Yeah. And I think that the real challenge is that this is not a problem that's going to go away in 1 or 2 seasons. So we're going to have to manage our way out of these, and the whole crop load Phytophthora protection program that goes forward will need to be quite carefully, there'll need to be good information, good advice given back to guide growers through that.
Sure, and presumably some really kind of careful monitoring of outcomes as well, so that if this happens again somewhere else, we've got that information to draw from next time.
Yeah. So we've talked quite a lot about Phytophthora because the roots were flooded for so long, but there are also other things that we do need to think about. Major protracted wetting events, damage to trees. With that comes European canker as another longer term pathogen that needs to be considered.
Which is bacterial?
No, it's fungal.
Fungal, okay.
So it's a fungal disease which we need to stay on top of. Growers are really going to need to have good canker management practices in place. We'll have more abandoned orchards because there are literally orchards that are not going to recover, or we are hopeful that some of those will be removed quickly.
Sure, and are we mindful, I guess, that those are potential reservoirs for other problems as well?
Yes, so things like fire blight, we need to be thinking about where we've got unmanaged, uncontrolled trees sitting alongside export production sites, where the trees are viable and continuing. Bees vector the fire blight pathogen, so infection in the unmanaged area now coming through and potentially presenting more of a challenge. So we are really going to have to think about the landscape around our orchard, and that as well in terms of movement of diseases out of those reservoirs of abandoned trees into our productive orchards. So Those are things that we need to be thinking about for the coming season. And then beyond that, we need to be thinking longer term as an institute and as an industry of identifying the things that we need to do to future-proof the industry from such catastrophic events. Obviously, infrastructure is a big thing, but it's the responsibility, I guess, of government and regional councils. All of that can be built back, but will need to be built back better. But then what can we do to build back better in terms of our future orchards? This is going to be quite critical. The choice of rootstocks. The industry, unfortunately, in its push for intensification, went very heavily down a path of M9 rootstock, which is a dwarfing rootstock, but it's susceptible to fire blight and susceptible to Phytophthora, along with some other susceptibilities. Highly productive rootstock, but highly susceptible to some of the key pathogens that we are now threatened by.
Sure. Are there other rootstocks that are used? Will we kind of see from this which have perhaps done better and which haven't, or do we simply not have much representation from other options anyway?
We do have other rootstocks and that out there. I mean, we've got the traditional rootstocks for the bigger trees, the Morling Merton series of rootstocks, so 109 and Morling 26. Bigger trees, perhaps a little bit more resilient in terms of flooding and greater resilience in terms of Phytophthora potentially. But the real issue, I guess, for the industry going forward is that we do need good dwarfing rootstocks that are resistant to both fire blight and Phytophthora. And to be fair, while there has been some work done on that, and there is some availability of rootstocks, when it comes to building back better, the availability of the newer rootstock material is constrained. It's highly constrained. So if we do need to replant a couple of thousand hectares of our apples over the next 10 years, have we got the rootstock availability to plant more resilient orchards for the future?
So that's potentially an area that needs some real focus around. Can it be scaled up, I guess?
We need to make good choices, and M9 is not a good choice. And unfortunately, there's a lot of M9 in the Hawke's Bay industry. We need to have alternatives to M9. That material needs to be available.
Presumably there are still, I mean, M9 might be a perfectly valid choice if you're up a free draining hill somewhere still. So thinking a little bit more about what suits a different location maybe is part of that too.
Absolutely, but you know, where we're located on the Heritonga Plains, it is a floodplain, and
that is why it's highly productive after all.
It is, and we need to utilise the Heritonga Plains. We actually need to have Phytophthora resistant rootstocks, but we need to not only think about the rootstocks, we need to think about if we are in areas of vulnerability to flooding, perhaps mounding or ridging in areas of poor drainage on the Heritonga Plains. So the silt issue would not be nearly the same issue if we simply had our trees planted, particularly in poor drainage areas or low-lying areas, on mounds or ridges.
Is that something that's practiced elsewhere?
Yes, it is practiced elsewhere. Not in New Zealand, but certainly I know when I first joined DSIR, there was a lot of work done in the Nelson region on ridging. And we're not talking large ridges, but we're talking about that. But in terms of protecting you from silt and waterlogging, that is really an important underlying principle if you're in a poor area of poor drainage.
So there's some potentially some genetics to think about, but also some management solutions that can really help to improve resilience to future events.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it's actually putting these things together, and I'm only describing two of those, but there are other ways of managing risks to what are catastrophic events.
Yeah.
And we've probably not had our eye on the ball. We've really thought, I guess, too much that we're protected by our infrastructure, by those stop banks. But when they do fail, and fail catastrophically, you can't afford to lose orchards, which represent intergenerational investment. There's been huge capital go into that orchard over many times. Orchards are built incrementally over time. It's very difficult to get the capital. It's around $200,000 a hectare to put a new orchard in. And you can't take on that sort of investment new. You've got to build incrementally over time.
But at a time, yeah. Yeah, so some big challenges ahead, but it does sound like there are already a few tools in the box that we can start to think about deploying, and presumably there'll be a lot of learnings from this that will inform that further too.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that Plant and Food actually has a key role here to provide some leadership and direction for the industry, particularly when it comes to planting systems, growing systems. When it comes to selection of rootstocks, I think the industry and Plant and Food can play a key role there. When it comes to propagation material, thinking about the number of trees that the industry will potentially need for it to go forward. How do we fast track that? So there's a lot that can be done.
And those are all sort of sets of expertise that are well within our skill set too.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like we've got a lot to offer, hopefully, and some big challenges ahead. Is there anything else that you think we should touch on?
Some drains worked around Hawke's Bay, some drains didn't because the system was full to capacity, so we didn't have water flow. So there's actually quite a lot of work, but that's sort of work that needs to be done either by the orchardists themselves, or some of it's obviously the regional council and making sure that drains are free flowing.
It sounds like there's really a lot that Plant and Food's kind of skill set has to offer the industry going forward. And it sounds as well, in a way that I'm really heartened by, Jim, that you yourself are quite positive about the future of the industry and really seeing a case for replanting in some cases in a way that's going to really enhance our resilience. That's fantastic to hear. Thank you so much for your time kind of overviewing us about the industry, and I'm now fortunate to have a chat as well with Peter Welch, who is the Orchard Manager here at Plant and Food Research, who'll talk a little bit about some of the consequences for our own orchards and what we can learn from that. So I'm joined now by Peter Welch, who is the Research Orchard Manager here at the Havelock North Plant and Food site, and he's been part of our team for 18 years now. Prior to that, he was a commercial orchardist himself, so suffice to say this is a man who knows his pipfruit. Peter, I wondered if you could start by telling us just briefly, what were your sort of first impressions waking up on that morning? Did you have any idea what you were popping into work to find?
Well, that was the thing, Rebecca. It was so regional that we knew it had rained, but it does. So I'm thinking locally within the sort of urban situation here, we didn't realise it was as bad until I started to get a feeling that my own personal back lawn had flooded, which it had never done before, and I had water views for the first time in my life. So I thought that looks quite serious. So I came into work early Tuesday morning, not knowing quite what to expect to find, until I started to drive down some major roads in the area that had big tree fell events. And I thought, well, this is looking a little bit more serious than I expected. By the time I got here and got to the orchard and Crosses Road, very aware of how wet it was, because neighbouring properties were suddenly underwater. And I didn't know quite what we were going to find. We have a good sump system and everything, and in the past, inevitably, they often break down on the day we need them, but they were running. And I thought, well, that's good. But the more I got into the orchard and on site, and it was heightened a little bit once I came into the building, because there had been a water leak, quite a substantial water leak through the building here.
Oh, no.
And so that triggered like, oh, okay, what's happening? So then I decided I needed to go looking and had put on my short red bands, realised they were far too short,
oh, no.
and then just realised how wet it really was and how much water we'd had in a very short time. And I think that was the thing, was the volume in a very short time on very, very wet ground, as it was.
Because it had already been such a wet summer, right? So you're at a point where it's already going to be tricky for water to drain away, and the Karamu stream behind our site was running really high too, wasn't it?
Very high. I mean, the example of the last year in January we had 21 mils in the whole of the month, and in the January of 23 we had 270 mils. So that on top, so this rain
10 times the rainfall before Gabrielle hits.
And we'd already had a very wet winter spring.
Yeah, sure.
So it was just like a sponge that was absolutely full, had nowhere to go.
So walking around our orchards, the site varies a little bit in its profile, I guess. Yeah. You would have seen everything from mud to what kind of height of standing water do you think?
Well, the highest of it is 6'6" or something, and the highest of it was over a metre, was well up my thigh. That was quite a large area. We had water that was probably half that over a much bigger area, but in an area that I'd never seen rain water sitting or standing at all. And then we had another part of it that you would hardly know there'd been that volume of rain. I guess it all flowed into the low points, but it just didn't. Yeah. And I think also our sumps, while they were working, the drainage system was so full and the rivers were so full and the sea was at high tide, nothing was escaping, nothing could get out. So it just backed up.
So how long did it take before you could start to see the water receding a little bit?
Oh, well, we probably had a good week where it sat and appeared not to move at all. Then on the parts where it was reasonably shallow, and also I hasten to add, we didn't have silt, so we were only waiting for water to go. I suppose we needed to pump. In our worst area, we pumped for 2 weeks solid, and it rained in between times and put us right back to the beginning. And we got the sumps going because, as it turned out, our water runs into council drainage systems, so they were all running backwards. So every time I pumped the water out, it came back anyway. So that was a month of doing that to get that sorted, and 2 weeks in the other block that is fully drained, but just couldn't get out. And so we had to put in extra pumps, and that was 2 weeks to do that. So it happened on 14th of February, and I suppose I felt like we'd turned a corner of control about 6 weeks later.
So suffice to say, our trees have had very wet feet.
Very.
What other damage did we sustain during the event?
We had, because it was windy as well, it was very windy, and high wind with very wet soil conditions.
And heavily laden trees,
and heavily laden, full production really. And our blocks are very closely planted, so they're 0.6 most as an average apart. So they're like big laden sails, just gathering the wind. And the easterly for Hawke's Bay is quite a strong wind generally. So a lot of blocks fell over, and they fell over from all those reasons, but also the structures, while they're more than adequate in a normal type scenario, they couldn't hold up laden trees with wet ground. So they fell over. Some trees broke, they just snapped off.
So when you say fell over, I guess that was my question, is are we talking about scions that have snapped from rootstocks, or the whole thing, the roots are up as well?
The majority of it was probably the whole thing, and a third of our sort of failures were breakages in older trees. And interestingly enough, usually M9 and 793-106 are pretty robust, but I think it was the load as much as anything. And then the wires and things that hold them up suddenly giving way. So you had sort of that shock effect, I guess.
Yeah, sure.
But the trees that just sort of fell over, they were only 3 years old, most of them, but they were very full. That's the end of their cycle, if you like, in the assessments. So that's the year they carry the most fruit.
Right.
And that year they were carrying quite a lot of fruit.
So the timing just couldn't have been worse, really. And so where you have a lot of trees that are either uprooted or broken away from their rootstocks, what are your prospects for remedial action?
Well, the ones that have broken off, we've canned those blocks. And there's only 3 areas, which collectively is quite a small hectare space. But the rest of it, we've propped them to start with, and then continued propping them to try and get them up as quickly as possible. And then we went through and reconstructed the structures. So put in more posts, took out the ones because we had a lot of broken posts, and then restrained and reattached the trees. And it seems to, well, I don't know if it's worked, but the trees haven't died yet. They had quite major interruption, obviously, but when they fell over and the roots were up, probably in most cases probably half the root structure was still in the ground, at least, more, maybe even 2/3. So we worked as quickly as we could to push those back, and it was very physical. We used some tractor work to pull them up, but mostly you just sort of had to get under the trees and try and heave them up.
It must have been really all hands on deck.
Well, it was, and it was quite, you had to then sort of do that and yell at someone to come in under quickly with a prop or something and hope it didn't all fall off again, because the last thing we wanted was them to collapse again, because then they would have broken.
Yeah, of course, and presumably taken their friends down with them as well.
Definitely. Yeah.
It's a phenomenal amount of work, and presumably very trying conditions with some staff who were at times pretty stressed about their own situations.
Yes, there was that, and I think there was that general shock malaise thing that had filtered right through Hawke's Bay by the time we were able to get onto the site. But we've over the years built up good relationships with our contractors, external people, and they were amazing. I just rang them and they said, "Oh, we were wondering what was how you were," sort of thing, and they turned up. Most of them turned up when we wanted them to, with the right gear, and were able to ram posts and strain things. And we had some big wind shelter panels that had moved, and so they were able to do 6-metre structures that were able to be redone. So while it was stressful, and on the first few days I just sort of stood in a puddle and wondered what we were going to do, once that started to happen and we were able to start moving forward, it felt like for this site only speaking, it was recoverable to a degree, and that was great. I know by the time we got to Easter, I felt like we're not ahead of it, but we're equal with it right now.
Yeah, and there is certainly the majority of our blocks are going to probably come through this more or less okay, right?
I hope so. That the telling time will be, I think, September, October, November period of 2023, as the buds break, and they'll try to flower, of course, and that will be the interesting point to see what the vascular collapse has been and whether they can support themselves. We're pruning them reasonably hard, those particular trees, to try and give them, or not have an overload on them, and then yes, we'll see. There will be losses. I expect there to be losses. We've had a lot of immediate losses in the summer fruit.
Of course, because that's we've been very focused in this podcast on the pipfruit industry, but that's far from the only group of folks affected.
Yes, and quite badly affected, and especially in areas where they haven't had this before. And they, of course, also were fully loaded trees. There was a very small amount of fruit had been harvested in the summer fruit.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So, and they don't like being in water at all. So they've collapsed. And which is sort of an advantage, because you can tell what's happened. You can see it's happened.
At least you can see it now, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's going to certainly be a reasonably white-knuckled few months for both us and for our friends in the industry as well, seeing really what the extent of some of the harm is, isn't it?
Definitely.
So, aside from the immediate work propping and then some careful pruning, what other remedial steps have needed to be taken?
We got on as soon as we could a phosphate-based foliar spray, to try and, for many reasons, but also to try and work against Phytophthora and those sorts of things. We will be very intense on the canker sprays. Then really that's sort of it. I didn't do any major fertiliser run, apart from anything else. It was so wet we couldn't get around anyway, but also it was a bit superfluous. We weren't really fighting growth. We didn't, we will have a full fert program, but we do anyway, coming up in the next month or so. But nothing for our site that would be too extraordinary to what we've done in the past.
It's really around being quite proactive about the disease management issues that might be coming. Yes.
And being aware, not sort of thinking, oh, those all look good, because as soon as we see some trees starting to show signs of maybe a prolonged and eventual death maybe, then it will certainly it needs to heighten our awareness of their neighbours and the rows beside and things like that. Because if that happens, we will look to lose at least a couple of thousand trees. And they're at the tail end of their cycle, so they're quite important. They haven't had any assessment work done on them. So obviously for us and for the science groups, especially more so for the science groups, they need, they want outcomes that don't put them back.
Yeah, it's a real stress at any time losing data, but particularly so I think when you're talking about whole trees in this case. Do you foresee as a result of this any longer, looking much longer term for the trees that are in the orchard now, if you can get through that period of carefully managing the disease stuff and maybe not overloading them, do you think the prognosis is pretty good? Is there anything extra you'll do?
Well, ironically, the thing possibly is that we're going out of La Nina into El Nino. So, of course, which heads into a very potentially dry. And although Hawke's Bay is more geared to cope with drought as best it can, that will accentuate a stress.
Yeah.
So, for a wee while it felt like our trees that were in water, and had been for a long time, like even the pears and things like that, were living hydroponically really. And now, well, that's going to suddenly stop. So, and we've got a beautiful day today, but and our water table is still very, very high. But as that starts to balance itself out and deplete, I won't be surprised if at the end of summer or I would say that we would start to do that. And then I guess it's just a matter of, as trees maybe die 5 years' time, of working out whether it's still a tail or is it just what was going to happen. Is it a disease or something? So I don't know. I wouldn't be brave enough to say we're going to be fine after this year, or brave enough equally to say, no, we're really in trouble in 5 years' time.
It's really a case of watch and wait still then.
It is really. I mean, we can aerate the soil as best we can, but that's slightly interruptive of regenerating roots. And also, it doesn't always work, because if you do that and open it up and you open up channels for the water to escape, but then in the summer you create other issues. So I think as long as we can keep our compaction to a minimum, all those sorts of things, and just be aware that they're living things, and none of us would be happy with a plastic bag over our face for any length of period of time, and it would have an effect on our breathing and our possibly longer term health. And I suppose in a way for us at Planted Food here, the largest area of affected trees are part of that regenerating cycle. So they go in for 3 to 4 years and then they come out. So we can do things to those blocks once we get the trees out, and which is what we do anyway. We do some regen and plant some green crops and things like that. And so we hopefully, we have a lot of land pressure, but we can make those areas absent from use for maybe 2 years, and they will, oddly enough, I've been digging trees and things in those areas, and the worm activity is amazing. Huge worms. So that's a really good sign that there's some air in there.
There's still a bit of life around.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. So it sounds, I guess, a little bit like business as usual management, but with some real extra vigilance for a little while.
Yes.
And good tools at your disposal already to try and manage some of the problems you might come across, which is super reassuring, I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, we're not being Pollyanna about it, and we're not being, stomping around in a black fug either. So it's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, sure.
And I think it's just about being aware, because of course everything's, dropped their leaves now, so it's very hard to make. But you can still look at the wood, see if it's starting to contract or shrivel or whatever. And if that's happening in trees up in those blocks that we thought they might be okay, well then there's some long-term effect.
Yeah, sure.
And I've seen that in the summer fruit. I've marked a lot of the trees that I thought, they might be okay, but no, they've gone.
And I guess, it's not a way anyone wants to learn lessons, but with that vigilant approach and really taking careful note of what's going on in response to this event and to some of your management interventions, there's a lot of learning to be taken from that as well, isn't there?
Yes, I think so. And it's something on this site that we've learned over the years when we've never had quite so much inundation, because that's more what it was than anything, about keeping the sumps fully active and things. And now I know that the council drains that we feed into were actually blocked in the council system. I will be requesting more often that they service them, because that's all it needs. And since they've been done, and we had 160 mils, 120 mils or something in June, the water, it all turned back into the same looking scenario, but it drained within 36 hours, it was gone. And it was because that water system, the drainage system, was working as it should have been.
The capacity's there again.
Yeah. So that's really good. So those sort of learnings of knowing that nothing ever stays the same, I suppose, and it can turn around and bite you, when you least expect it. And lying in bed and thinking, oh, that's a nice sound. Rain on the roof doesn't guarantee that.
I can imagine not too many folks in Hawke's Bay lie in bed thinking, gosh, that rain sounds nice at the moment. Yeah, it's certainly been a hell of a few months for folks here. But it's been a really lovely chat with both you and Jim, and encouraging to hear that both of you are really positive about the future of the industry and the role that Plant and Food can play in kind of helping it find its feet again, dry its feet as needed, and move forward and be stronger out the other side as well, we hope.
Yes, well, I think, and it's good for, in a way, in a contrary sort of way, that we did have flooding, that we can't necessarily nudge up against the people who have had the terrible silt inundations and terrible silt effect, but we did have a lot of flooding. It has had an effect, it will have an effect, and so it gives us a certain amount of street cred amongst growers.
You're seeing the same sorts of problems.
And their first thing is, oh, it wouldn't have affected you. But then when I have the opportunity to say, well, actually, this, and they get, there's a general surprise, because we're all surprised by each other's experience of it.
And it sounds like it's been incredibly variable, just depending where you were in the region.
Definitely.
Hey, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today, Peter. It's really fantastic to hear that overall you're feeling reasonably positive about things here at the Hawke's Bay site. And as you say, we're being treated to a beautiful classic Hawke's Bay winter's sunny day. And let's hope many more of those to come. Absolutely. And perhaps not too severe in El Nino next year. Let's try and find that happy medium of rainfall for a year or two going forward.
There's two ways, isn't it? There's the sunny side up or in the gloom, and it's very boring sitting in the bottom of a bucket, I'd say.
Strong agree, but all the same, it's it's hard to keep that focus, and it's impressive that folks here have managed to. Thank you so much for the chat. And thank you, listeners, very much for listening to another Sigest podcast today. It's been a fascinating topic to cover, and I think we will be really interested to revisit this one in a year or two and see how things are progressing in the region and for the industry. In the meantime, you can find other Sigest podcasts either on the Plant and Food website or on your favourite podcast provider, and we really do appreciate if you can give them a review or a rate while you're there. Thank you so much. Mā te wā.